We'll still have some other attendees trickling in over the next couple of minutes. My name is Ian Latimer. I'm a program manager here at NYSERDA. I work for a team called the Clean Energy Siting Team. You have me to thank and/or blame for the recurring emails you've been receiving over the last couple of weeks with regard to this webinar. So thank you to those who registered and made it here. We're really happy to have the opportunity to present to you today. The topic for today's presentation is regarding energy storage. A topic of a lot of interest to communities across the state of New York, but specifically with regard to the 2025 bulk energy storage solicitation, a competitive procurement by which NYSERDA is entering into contract with bulk energy storage projects around the state of New York. So the fact that you're here is really wonderful. Thank you for proactively taking the time to come learn about this technology or the technologies that are eligible for the solicitation. We're excited to be with you. John, please advance to the next slide. Just want to note for everybody that the presentation is being recorded so that we can make a recording available for future stakeholders and community representatives to access on the NYSERDA website. Attendees are muted and camera off upon entry. Hopefully no one got too glammed up for their time on the WebEx today, because your cameras will remain off. But again, thank you for being here. If you've got questions, which we would certainly love to get from our attendees here, you can submit them in writing through the Slido Q&A feature, which is integrated into WebEx. For those that may not be familiar, if you locate the three dots in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you should be able to select the Slido Q&A feature, into which you can enter your questions, which we will look forward to addressing as soon as we are able to throughout the course of the webinar, perhaps, but then also at the end during some dedicated Q&A time, which we will hopefully still have. We will be posting the recording and the slides from today's webinar on the NYSERDA website. It's nyserda.ny.gov/ISCRFP, which is an acronym that you will be familiar with as part of the presentation today, but it is the Index Storage Credit Request for Proposals, also known as the procurement that we are talking about today. And if you have any technical questions or issues that arise throughout today's webinar, please reach out to our wonderful colleague, John. His email is on screen, john.necroto@nyserda.ny.gov. He is also the one advancing our slides today, and we thank him very much for that. John, if you actually don't mind going back one slide, I just want to say one thing, which those of you who may have seen me speak before, including on the New York Planning Federation webinar yesterday, throughout the course of this presentation, you'll notice that wherever possible, I've included photos of real operating energy storage facilities that are actively playing a role in adding value to the electric grid in New York today. And I think that it's really important to do that because I want to help folks visualize and understand that, to some degree, we are talking about technologies that may be new in your community or may be new in your part of the state. But energy storage plays a critical role in keeping your lights on and keeping your computer running today in New York. And so I want to point that out wherever possible. This is an example of a bulk energy storage facility in the capital region in Stillwater. John, if you go to the next slide. The background of this one is, again, an operating energy storage facility paired with solar, which you can see in a canopy sort of in the middle top of the photo, located in the Bronx, downstate. Next slide, please. I will just quickly give a sort of overview of the agenda for today's webinar before inviting a colleague of ours to speak and kick us off. We've really got four main topics that we're going to be going over in this webinar, and apologies where there's duplication for those that may have seen myself or another NYSERDA staff member speak recently. We will kick off with an introduction to energy storage. We'll keep it somewhat brief, but hopefully provide a comprehensive introduction. From there, we will talk about the thing that brings us here today, which is the 2025 bulk energy storage solicitation. From there, we will spend a few minutes talking about planning and zoning considerations for energy storage. We will then pivot to talking about fire safety considerations regarding energy storage systems. And then we'll wrap up with a quick overview of some of the resources that NYSERDA and other agencies have available for local governments with regard to battery energy storage systems in particular. Throughout the webinar today, you'll be hearing from folks like myself, members of our clean energy siting team, as well as colleagues from our large scale resources and the bulk energy storage teams as well. So that's who you've got on the call here. Again, thank you so much to those who have joined. I'll invite my colleague Seth to kick us off with a few words.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Seth Dunn. I lead NYSERDA's bulk energy storage program, and our goal is to, deploy safe, reliable, and affordable what's called bulk or utility scale energy storage to support the state's energy goals. I'll just, and Ian will talk about the benefits of storage, but I will just note that, especially over the last year or two, we are seeing in peer states of ours, of New York's, like California and Texas, tangible results and tangible evidence of bulk energy storage providing many, many benefits, from lowering energy costs to keeping the lights on during extreme weather events to enabling more renewable energy. But of course, and this is why we're here, successful storage projects depend on community engagement and support. So we're grateful for the partnership we have within NYSERDA at with the clean energy siting team. So the kind of the twofold roles of our teams within NYSERDA are: number one, ensure host local communities have the information they need to make siting decisions, siting and permitting decisions. And number two, to ensure that awarded projects, including for this current solicitation, are responsibly sited and are safely designed and operated. And the rest of the team here, Ian, Abby, Veronica, Bill, will share exactly how we fulfill that. And the agenda kind of reflects that, whether it's addressing community engagement and permitting progress when we evaluate projects, in developing model local laws and resources, and supporting other local activities, and finally working closely to make New York a leader in terms of fire safety. So thanks again for joining. We look forward to continuing this dialogue with you, and back to you, Ian.
Thanks, Seth. I'll note one clarification real quick. I know there may be some confusion. It is the good year 2026, and you're saying 2025 solicitation. The solicitation began in 2025. So you can, on the website referenced previously, you are able to access the documents that go along with the procurement when it was launched in 2025. So we are in progress. That is why it is labeled as 2025, and you'll see that number appear a few more times. For those of us who still haven't gotten used to writing 2026 in our dates, I'm sure that this will not be the most helpful, but hopefully we can keep that clear. Next slide, please, John. So yeah, we'll again kick us off with a brief introduction to energy storage. The photo that you see here is an example of a co-located energy storage facility alongside a community solar project in central New York. Next slide, please, John. So why are we talking about energy storage? There's a few sort of driving questions that I think that are worth naming real quick before we get into it, because I think oftentimes when people start talking about the electric grid, they start talking in industry language, which may not mean a lot to a lot of people. Some of the main questions that people who are responsible for overseeing the grid are asking are relatively simple at face value, right? Do we have enough electricity? Do we have it when we need it? Those kinds of questions are typically under the umbrella of thinking like resource adequacy, right? Are the resources that we have or are planned adequate to provide service to our customers? Is the grid that we have set up resilient or reliable? Can it withstand strain or challenges to the grid, whether those are challenges related to temperature or weather conditions? Is it a reliable and resilient system? And then finally, as Seth mentioned, can we avoid or minimize, or where inevitable, manage the costs of operating and maintaining the electric grid for customers in New York? That's sort of the affordability bucket, right? So when we're thinking about deploying new assets to the grid, or we're thinking about extending the life of existing assets, it's often with these sort of lenses in mind, right? Does it contribute to resource adequacy? Does it help with reliability and resiliency of the grid? And can we do it in an affordable manner? Next slide. Energy storage, helps address all of those questions at all different levels or sectors of the grid, right? So when we think about the players involved in the grid, starting from the smallest level, you've got residential and business or commercial customers who are paying an electric utility for electricity, which helps them power their residential or commercial operations or lives. Above them, you've got our electric service utilities who are responsible for administering safe and reliable service in their different territories around the state of New York. These are the utilities that you pay your electric bill to on a monthly basis. And then above them, you've got a grid operator, which in New York is the New York Independent Systems Operator, or the NISO. At each of these levels, there is opportunity for energy storage to play a significant role in helping people make sure that they have electricity, making sure that it is operating in a reliable and safe manner, and that it can be done in a way that is affordable and or makes you less, impacted by your monthly utility bills. I'm not going to get into all the individual use cases that you see here on the slide, but I'll just give you sort of maybe one example at all levels, right? So if you are a residential utility customer and you are in a utility that has implemented a time of use billing arrangement by which you pay more for electricity at certain points of the day and less at others, installing energy storage, whether or not you have solar on your roof, but likely alongside your solar installation, when you install energy storage, it can help you avoid the time of use billing impacts, right? You can avoid using electricity at times when it's most expensive, charge your battery during times of low cost, and therefore save on your bills. Commercial customers might do it the same way, right? They might be thinking about this purely from an economics perspective. They also might have critical equipment that they need to keep online. Maybe they don't want to install a gas generator, and so they choose to, install an energy storage system as a way of making sure that they have backup power. Certainly an option, and certainly a technology we've seen deployed for that use case. At the utility level, a lot of the utilities in the state of New York are investing in technologies under the guise of non-wires alternative projects, which means ways that they can defer the need to expend millions and millions of dollars on new electric distribution lines or new substation equipment. So energy storage systems can be a great opportunity for them to balance out supply and demand within their territory and therefore avoid the need to spend millions of dollars on miles of new lines or new, again, substation equipment. And then high level for the grid operator, energy storage is a great opportunity for the NISO and other transmission operators to balance supply and demand on the grid, right? At all times, the NISO is responsible for making sure that the amount of electricity that's being used across the state of New York is the amount that's being generated or imported. And so energy storage can help make sure that those numbers stay as even as possible by responding quickly when there are spikes in demand or dips in demand. So I think one of the reasons it's important to name this is that energy storage is not a monolith, right? I think we are all more familiar with a solar panel or a wind turbine. We understand often what it is. We understand maybe even how it works, but we know it kind of does one thing regardless of how big it is, right? Energy storage is not quite that way. It can look one way it might look the same physically, but it can be providing different services depending on whose system it is and how and why it was installed. Next slide. Thank you. Again, we've got some photos, and unfortunately, I was not able to label these, so I apologize. These are some photos of what I mean, right? These are photos of real installations in New York, with the exception of the garage photo on the left. I'm not sure whose garage that is, but unfortunately, NYSERDA does not have photos of people's garages around the state of New York. So this one, you'll forgive me, came from the internet. These are photos of different projects providing those different services, right? So on the left, you can see what we would call a residential installation or a behind the meter. And when we say behind the meter, really what we mean is that the installation is directly tied to the electric use or to the load of the customer, right? So this is a behind the meter residential installation located in the customer's garage, likely paired with their rooftop solar installation. The second photo is an example again of a behind the meter system. This time it is a non-residential commercial installation. This is not paired with solar. This is at an office park in Westchester in Con Ed service territory and is helping the tenant avoid costly time of use billing arrangements again, right? So every day it is charging and discharging to ensure that this customer is saving on their electric bill. As we shift to the right, you get towards what we would call front of the meter installations, which are directly interconnecting into the electric grid. They're not necessarily tied to an on-site customer. But in this example, it would be paired with solar, and I believe it's a community solar installation. So it may be providing services for offsite customers, whereby people are subscribing to a project for discounts on their electric bill, but it's not necessarily tied to an individual tenant or commercial operation on site at the installation. Those are all projects that would be funded if they chose to seek an incentive through a NYSERDA program, through our residential and retail program. Those are not the projects that we are here to talk about today. We are talking about what we call bulk, or you can think of it as large scale. Some people call it utility scale. For the purposes of the webinar today, we'll call these bulk. We have a bulk energy storage program, which competitively awards projects via solicitations. Generally speaking, you're looking at 20 megawatts and up, but I think technically anything 5 megawatts and up is eligible. And yeah, so those are the projects for the sake of the webinar today that we're really here to focus on. Next slide. Final reason that we're talking about energy storage. This is a really important graphic that we won't spend too much time on it. New York and elsewhere around the country are experiencing load growth. And when we talk about load means electricity demand, right? So think about energy intensive industries such as computing, manufacturing, and other economic development projects. You can think about the increase in electrification of vehicles and buildings. There are more people needing electricity today than there have been ever. And so all around the country, but particularly all around the state of New York, we are seeing load growth. So I think there's often a propensity to think that energy projects being installed in one part of the state are doing so for the benefit of someone in a different part of the state, right? And you can understand perhaps why that may be true. But if you look at who is looking to interconnect to the grid, you can understand that there is increased electricity demand everywhere that you look in New York State, right? You can see whether it's Micron in central New York, whether it's data centers that are being proposed in various parts of the state, or other economic development initiatives. There is a tremendous need for electricity everywhere you look. So I think it kind of dispels some of the preconceived notions about who and where is benefiting from energy projects being installed in the state of New York. It's really an all hands on deck effort. It's also not just a New York effort. It really all around the country, we are seeing pretty unprecedented levels of load growth in the queue. Next slide, please. Real quick introduction. So we want electrical energy, right? Energy storage, when you hear those two words, they don't mean one thing, right? So energy storage just means a technology that's capable of storing and or converting energy from one form to another. In this case, we are typically wanting electrical energy as the form that we want. So John, if you hit next slide a couple times, we'll get some transitions. Some examples of energy storage technologies. One more, my friend. The first one would be chemical or electrochemical battery, electrochemical energy storage, rather, excuse me. The main example that we'll all be familiar with for electrochemical energy storage would be batteries, right? That you're using an electrochemical reaction based on the materials that are in the battery to release electricity, which we then can use. They're not the only form of energy storage, though, right? Mechanical energy storage, for example, pumped hydroelectric facilities or compressed air or other compressed gas. Those utilize different materials as a mechanical means of turning a turbine to generate electricity. Thermal energy storage is also possible. The example I included here is like a solar hot water heater. They're not common in New York, but if any of you have traveled to other parts of the country or other parts of the world, you might have seen these. It's not the same type of solar panel, but basically it's leveraging energy from the sun to heat hot water for free. Well, not free, you have to buy the system, but then once you have it installed, it's for free. So those are leveraging energy from the sun to store it sort of as a thermal battery and then release hot water when you want it. Next slide. Once again, want to name that these are not hypothetical, right? So we are talking about a large deployment of technology. This is not all novel, right? So mechanical energy storage has existed in the state of New York. You've got the Blenheim-Gilboa Power Station. You've also got a pumped hydroelectric facility incorporated at Niagara Falls out in Western New York. You got examples of flywheel energy storage, which is another mechanical energy storage technology. You've got battery energy storage systems. These are not hypothetical. These are real projects that have been built and operated at various times to varying degrees in the state of New York to provide grid services. Next slide, please. You can just see here a quick snapshot. This is an example of a data set that lives on the NYSERDA website. If you're ever interested to see energy storage deployment by county or cumulatively, you can access it here. Currently, there's over 7,000 energy storage projects in the state of New York, many of them residential and small commercial, some of them what we would call bulk energy storage projects, for a total of about 525 megawatts. Next slide, please. So we talked energy storage, right? We know there's multiple technologies. We've got pumped hydro and other mechanical technologies. It's worth naming that the bulk of energy storage being deployed today is battery energy storage systems. And that is due to a few factors. Quickly, we'll name them. Technology maturity, right? Batteries are a very mature technology that are used in commercial and consumer applications all across our economy. Falling costs associated with batteries. You know, anytime that you've got costs falling, you're more likely to see that technology being deployed. Siting considerations, the efficiency of battery energy storage systems, the density of energy storage systems, and then the scalability. Next slide, please. When I talk scalability, really what I mean is, you know, they're highly modular systems, right? So when you think about a battery energy storage system at its simplest, you've got cells, battery cells, which are wired together to form battery modules. Those modules are wired together to form battery racks. And from there and there, you're able to scale based on the size of the installation required. So when you see an energy storage system, you can often sort of break it down into individual cabinets that are just, you know, tacked on, tacked on, tacked on based on the size of the installation that they want. There's other key equipment that also is included to go from talking about battery energy storage to a battery energy storage system, right? And a couple of those key pieces of equipment include the battery management system, which is your brains, eyes, and ears of the battery. It's capable of monitoring conditions within the battery down to the cellular level. And therefore, if and where there is an issue with regard to a single cell or a single module within the battery, it is able to respond to it. It can isolate, you know, cells or modules experiencing issues from other parts of the system to prevent those issues from spreading within the system. It's also capable of triggering incident response if and when there is a need for it based on an issue within the system. Highly sophisticated piece of technology that's handling thousands of pieces of data at any given second. There's also this larger bundle of what we would consider balance of system equipment. So part of an energy storage installation will include HVAC. It will include a power conversion system integrating the project to the grid. It will include gas and fire detection and monitoring equipment. There's a variety of different pieces of equipment that are required as part of a system. Some of that will depend on the technology as dictated by the fire code, which we will talk about in just a little bit here. Next slide, please, John. I think this is my final slide on the introduction. I just want to name that storage continues to evolve, right? Especially here in New York, in a state that prizes innovation the way that we do. There's a lot of different variables that are driving changes in the energy storage industry. Number one, by far, is safety. Costs as well, improving energy density and the physical footprint of these installations, duration, which is a key concept. When I say duration, what we mean is the ability for an energy storage system to dispatch energy over time, right? So often we think about, you know, solar and wind systems as being capable of generating, you know, X megawatts at any given moment based on conditions. Energy storage is thought of not just about the amount it can dispatch at any given moment, but also how long is it capable of dispatching that amount of electricity for. And that's what we mean by when we say duration. So typically a battery maybe would be a 4-hour duration, which means it can dispatch X amount of kilowatts or megawatts for 4 hours. the ability to dispatch for longer and longer periods of time is certainly something that people are looking for from, batteries, and therefore a place for improvement in the industry. And then final, material availability and recoverability, right? Can we rely less on, critical minerals and other things that are extracted, versus other battery technologies that maybe can use more simple, highly available materials? Those are all things that are driving innovation in the space. And finally, I'd be remiss to not mention that New York is a leader in battery innovation. Those of us that are joining from the Southern Tier might know that out of Binghamton, you've got the New Energy New York Coalition. It is one of 10 regional innovation engines funded federally by the National Science Foundation. The man behind it, or one of the men behind it, as you see in this conference photo, is the co-inventor of the lithium-ion battery. His name is Dr. Stan Whittingham. He calls Binghamton University home. We're very lucky to have him in New York, helping make New York a leader in innovation. And so, yeah, that's the introduction. I will now turn it to my colleague Abby to turn to the bulk storage procurement.
Great. Thanks, Ian. So I will give you all a quick overview of this solicitation and what it means for a project to apply to it, and what we're looking at in terms of timeline. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so to start off here with this solicitation, so ISC RFP 25-1 is its formal name. New York State is looking to procure index storage credits. So developers are bidding energy storage projects, but the thing that we are ultimately procuring from them are these credits, which are a market-based mechanism that provides the project owners with greater revenue certainty. And so what that means is that they essentially bid to us a strike price, which is their estimation of what project revenues they need for the project to be viable. And then we take that strike price and index it against the wholesale energy and capacity market to come up with the index storage credits that these projects will receive. And I'll go through that in the next slide in a little bit more detail, but one ISC is equal to 1 megawatt hour of discharge capability per day. So what this ultimately looks like is developers are bidding their energy storage projects into our RFP. We take those bids, review them with a team of reviewers, and kind of start to parse through the projects that we see here. Some of them will go into this not awarded bucket where they're ineligible or they didn't score very well. And I have a slide in a little bit on eligibility. And then other projects will ultimately receive an award with the state. And so that means that they were eligible under the criteria set out in this RFP, and they also scored well in evaluation. That award from NYSERDA is not a green light that this project will be built. What that means is that they just have additional revenue certainty from NYSERDA that they will be paid for these index storage credits, and that those projects will continue to move through all of their normal project development processes. So that's where your host communities come in. So whatever you have in your zoning ordinances, or whatever permitting processes you have, or stakeholder engagement requirements, those all still stand, and projects still have to move through all of those processes, and they only receive payment from us at the state once that project has completed those processes, has finished construction, and is connected to the grid, operational and available. So that's when they start getting paid from us. So we can go to the next slide to see what those payments actually look like. So as I was mentioning, the ISC price that we give out to developers, that's taking the strike price, which is their threshold for project viability, and subtracting out a reference price, which we estimate based on wholesale energy and capacity market prices. So in this illustrative example, if a project bid with a strike price of $100 per ISC, and in their first month, they the reference price is only $75 per ISC, then us at NYSERDA, we are giving them that difference. So we're making them whole. But in a different month, so we can go to the next slide, it may work differently. So in this instance, if the reference price is above what they bid to us, so they're receiving excess revenues, then if you click one more time, the developer is actually paying that money back to the state. So that's kind of the beauty here of the indexing, is that it both protects ratepayers by protecting them from excessive project revenues, but it also gives the developers enough certainty so that they can build these projects on the timelines that we need them to. So if you click forward again, so yeah, that's the payment from the developer to NYSERDA. And then we can, there we go. Okay. So how do we actually decide which projects receive ISDs versus the battery storage projects that don't? So we have a set of eligibility criteria, and then we have a set of criteria that we evaluate these projects on. So to be eligible for ISD 25-1, these projects have to be electrically interconnected to the New York grid. So as Ian was mentioning at the top, these are both projects that are connected to the New York grid. These are not distribution projects. They have to have at least 5 megawatts of power capacity. Ian also covered this at the top, that a lot of these projects are larger, but that's as small as they could possibly be. And they have to use commercialized energy storage technologies. So in many cases, that's lithium-ion batteries. Those are the batteries we're all familiar with. But there are other commercialized energy storage technologies that Ian also touched on, of like pumped hydro storage and other types of battery chemistry as well. So for the most part, what we're talking about here is lithium-ion, but there are other energy storage options, which we're happy to cover if that's of interest. And then these projects have to be placed in service by December 31st, 2030. So that is something that was ordered to us by the Public Service Commission, and that's to help New York State meet its battery storage goals, or energy storage goals, rather. And so when we receive these projects, then we evaluate them on these factors. So 60% of evaluation is dedicated to price alone. And so the divide here, the way that I like to think about it, is that the price factor is the question, trying to answer the question of, can this project deliver electricity affordably to New Yorkers? And then the non-price portion is, what are the risks to New York State with this project, and also what are the benefits that it can bring to New Yorkers? So the price portion is strictly on that strike price that the projects bid to us. So affordability is a huge part of this program. And then the non-price factors, that's where the risk and benefits come in. So we evaluate them on project viability and maturity, and that's where we look at things like safety and security screenings, or permitting progress, or interconnection risk, and things like that. We also look at the electricity system value, so those kind of additional services that they can provide to the grids, and then the economic benefits that they can bring to New Yorkers. So how much money does this developer spend in New York State on New York State goods to build this project? And next slide. So ultimately, this RFP is the result of years of public planning. It goes back to 2018 when New York first established its energy storage goals, and it's been iterating ever since. And so this RFP was released back in July of 2025. We did public comment to figure out what should go into this RFP. We've been working through an implementation plan. There's a separate program manual that outlines more of the fire safety portion. And one thing to note here is that when projects submitted their proposals on December 11th, 2025, so that line right above where the cells turn blue here, if you had a project that was proposed in your community, they should have notified you, and they should have notified you before that deadline. So for some of you, this will be familiar, and I'm hoping that those of you that are not familiar, it means that you don't have a project in your community and not that you weren't notified. But from there, we will be receiving price bids from proposers, and after that, we will make project information public. So there will be a public project summary that will go onto NYSERDA's bulk storage website. So that will be after we receive prices at the end of January and before we award projects in Q1 of 2026. So if you see that a project is proposed in your community and it's on this public site and that's a surprise to you, you should let us know. There shouldn't be any surprises. But we are authorized to release one of these ISC RFPs for the next 2 years. So we have 3 ISC RFPs that we are running with the goal of ultimately procuring 3 gigawatts of energy storage capacity. And as I mentioned at the top, these projects will come in service by December 31st, 2030. So that is the quick overview of the RFP, what we're looking for, and where we're currently at. And yeah, happy to take any of your questions on the RFP at the end of the webinar, but we can go to the next slide.
Thanks, Abby. I'm happy to take it back here. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about planning and zoning, right? The key thing to know here is that local governments play a really critical role in the responsible regulation of energy storage projects in the state of New York. And so want to spend a few moments going over that role, what it looks like, and how we think municipalities can prepare for responsible administration of their duties as authorities having jurisdiction for development. As always, I'll throw out their photo in the background, another one of these commercial installations. It's a project at another business park providing on-site services to a commercial customer. Next slide, please, John. First off, I want to say a sincere congratulations to everyone here on the webinar, because all of your communities already have robust enforceable regulations in place to oversee the safety of energy storage installations. Click for me, John. Reveal what that means. It's the fire code. All jurisdictions outside of New York City, the unified code, the fire code in the state of New York, the uniform fire prevention and building code, that is automatically applicable without the need for local action. And what that means is, as of January 1st of 2026, the updated fire code is in effect in your jurisdiction. That's wonderful. We also all know that the fire code without actual enforcement of the code is not the most meaningful thing. It's a document that lives somewhere that not everyone is paying attention to. And so certainly there's work to be done. We think municipal planning and zoning is a key part of responsible regulations, but I just want to take this step to say there are really robust nation-leading regulations to ensure safe operations of energy storage in the state of New York that you did not have to lift a finger today, and it is applicable in your community. The reason it's also worth talking about that is that the fire code and zoning are not the same thing. And I think a lot of the times when it comes to adopting regulations for a specific type of building or a specific technology, there's a tendency to adopt regulations that either go up against or potentially are duplicative of things that are in the fire code. We think it's really important, because there are existing regulations in place in the fire code, to identify opportunities to look at energy storage from a zoning perspective without duplicating or being in conflict with those things that are in the fire code. So we'll be talking about the fire code on this webinar, but we're going to really focus here on planning and zoning as a separate but related consideration. Next slide, please, John. So why should local governments consider proactively planning for energy storage? And I know we spent time earlier talking about how we're mostly going to talk about bulk projects here, and we will, but I just want to quickly think about this a bit more comprehensively. John, I'm going to have you click 4 times for me here, my friend. There's a variety of use cases, right? So we've seen examples of these types. One more time for me. There you go. We've seen examples of these types of installations before, right? You've got a residential battery installation inside a garage on the top left. You've got another one of those office park installations on the top right. On the bottom left, you have a 1.8 megawatt hour battery that is in a parking lot, which is connected to a rooftop community solar installation on top of a big box chain. And then on the bottom right is an example of a bulk project. It's a standalone battery. It's not connected to solar. It's just plugging into the grid out in Western New York. What do all 4 of these installations have in common, right? We've got a mix of sizes of technologies. We've got some that are paired with solar. We've got some that are standalone. What do they all have in common? Next slide, please, John. One more time, one more click for me. Two more clicks for me. Sorry. They're subject to local permitting authority, right? So each one of those installations that you saw there, the permit that allowed that project to move forward was issued by the local permitting authority. You might hear us use the acronym AHJ. What that means is the authority having jurisdiction. That is from a land use and planning perspective, right? So when we think about an AHJ, we think about the body, the municipal body that has permitting authority over a land use. Typically in New York, that's going to be a town, a village, a city. And so when we say AHJ, when we say permitting authority, that's what we mean, right? It's the town or the village or the city that's responsible for reviewing and administering permits. This table gives you an understanding of permitting authority for projects in the state of New York. So for those that may be more familiar with the permitting landscape for large wind and solar or even gas or fuel oil generating facilities, right? You know that there has been a state permitting process for large scale generation for a long time, right? This is not a new thing. Now, it's changed, right? There's different entities in the state that are responsible for reviewing and administering permits for those large scale projects. Currently, when we're talking about clean generation like wind and solar or even batteries, when we think about a state permitting process, it's the one that's administered by the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, or ORES. As opposed to local permitting, which is subject to the State Environmental Quality Review Act as administered by the local permitting authority, as well as any local regulations that are on the books, such as zoning laws that have been implemented by the AHJ. So that is the sort of primer for the top row of this table. The second row of the table tells you who's responsible for permitting generation, right? So projects that are creating electricity, like wind and solar. A large scale or bulk generator that's larger than 25 megawatts, that goes through a permitting process administered at the state level through ORES, whereas anything under 25 megawatts for wind and solar is permitted locally. And that means that anything from like a rooftop solar installation to a 5 megawatt community solar project that's taking up, 25 or 30 acres, those projects will be subject to your local permitting pathway. And that's really it, right? So for renewables like wind and solar, the only thing that's determining it is the size of the installation. For energy storage, it's going to depend on two things. Size certainly matters, but it's also a question of whether or not the storage facility is paired with generation. So if you have a battery that's paired with a large-scale solar or wind project, which would otherwise be permitted by ORES, the battery will also be permitted by ORES. And thus far, I believe that the state office has issued permits for maybe one or two energy storage facilities that's co-located with a renewable generator. But the bottom row of the table really underscores the importance of municipal planning and proactivity, right? Because what you see here is that any standalone battery, regardless of the size, whether it's 1 megawatt, whether it's 50 kilowatts, whether it's a residential battery, any standalone energy storage system is subject to local permitting. For that reason, it's really important that local governments understand their role as the permitting authority for this land use in their area. And we really encourage them to take proactive steps to understand the technology, understand how they can regulate it, and take meaningful action to implement those regulations in their laws. Next slide, please, John. Talked about various use cases, talked about local permitting authority. Two other reasons I just want to quickly plug why we think local governments should be proactively planning and taking a nuanced approach to this. Balancing constituent and shared benefits with impacts. What I mean by that here is that we've seen communities take a variety of different steps to regulating installations of energy storage and solar, for that matter, in their areas. And that includes people who've taken really a one-size-fits-all black and white approach, which is to say, we don't want this. Any size, any technology, we're not interested. And all I'm going to say here is that when you do that, you think about the different use cases and the benefits that can be provided by energy storage that we've talked about throughout this presentation, whether it's for, individual residents in your community who just want to pay less on their utility bills on a monthly basis, to manufacturers or business owners who are interested in battery backup power, or pairing battery with energy solar on their roof to lower their own bills. Um, Local laws have consequences, right? And so I think to not consider the potential benefits or impacts to your constituents, I think is, a missed opportunity, even if you have concerns about, what it means to plan for and zone these larger projects that you may be less familiar with. It's really important to think about that. Um, Finally, the reason that it's important to proactively consider and plan for energy storage is that we want to see people moving beyond moratoria. All right. I think we all know that moratoria are a key part of the land use toolkit that local governments have in the state of New York to ensure that they're taking timely and reasonable action on regulations in their community. We've also seen people adopt moratoria and then extend them and extend them and extend them, perhaps in response to individual applications, or perhaps just because it's a technology that is understandably very hard to wrap your mind around, or very hard to get, factual information on that's not from a source that has a vested interest in building a project in your community. Those are very real concerns, and ones that I think we definitely empathize with. But at the same time, that's not a legal use of moratoria powers. And so we really want to make sure that we can support local governments to where they need to, meaningfully take steps while under moratoria to resolve their moratorium and have a good, well-considered law and regulations on the books afterward. Next step, please. When planning for energy technologies generally, there's a few different questions that are important to be thinking about in terms of where projects get proposed, right? So the first and foremost thing is that we want to be thinking about where is there electrical infrastructure in the community? And is that electrical infrastructure primed to be able to take on new projects, right? And so that's why you've got an electric utility. You've also got a statewide grid operator who's responsible for doing, for administering what we call interconnection, right? So they're the ones who are receiving applications from energy projects and reviewing whether or not they actually make sense to be added to the grid where they're proposed. So that grid infrastructure is really the first question you want to be asking when you're, from a land use and planning perspective, considering where energy technologies might even be possible in your community, right? If you were to adopt a zoning law that just says they're, only available in the, the planned development district in the community, and then you go look at the actual infrastructure available in the planned development district and you see that it's wholly inadequate, there's not a substation nearby, or if there is, it's overloaded and unlikely to be able to take on new projects. That approach is not actually congruent with where development is likely, and so it's worth really understanding the infrastructure that's available in your community. We also want to think about appropriate locations, right? Whether or not something is congruent with alternate uses in one district versus another. Those are key questions with any land use, not just energy projects. Of course, you want to think about bulk and area standards. You want to think about your environmental and visual and agricultural impacts, all of the same questions that you'd be asking as part of developing zoning regulations for any land use. Decommissioning, taxation, these are critical questions for any energy technology. Next slide, please. When we specifically talk about battery energy storage, I would say that there's a couple of things that we would bump up the list on the critical questions in terms of local planning, and there's a couple of that we would bump down a bit. Visual impacts and agricultural impacts, I would not say to bump down because we never think that they will be of a concern with regard to an energy storage project. It's simply that these projects do not have the physical footprint of these large wind and solar generation projects that you may be familiar with, right? You've seen a bunch of photos of these installations throughout this presentation. They are modular projects. They look like shipping containers. They are not, hundreds of feet tall. They do not take up massive acreage. The amount of, land being used is much smaller for these projects, and therefore the corresponding visual impact is likely to not be, so significant. Similarly, because of the reduced footprint, agricultural impacts in terms of removing, large amounts of acreage from production, less likely to be a primary concern. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be asking. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be getting information about those impacts as part of an application, but you're less likely to have those be a critical focus when reviewing a site plan, for example, compared to other energy technologies or other land uses. What does get bumped up the list is fire safety and incident management training, right? Are we making sure that our local fire service is being, brought in for consultation on any applications? Are we making sure that we are enforcing compliance with the fire code as needed without duplicating the fire code within our land use and zoning laws, right? So those are critical questions, and that's why we will be turning to fire safety in just a couple of minutes here. Next slide, please. Really quick, when planning for, energy storage or solar, maybe you guys have seen some of these images in the solar context. There's a couple of different ways you can go about it. Generally speaking, most municipalities that are looking to adopt regulations for a specific technology will just incorporate it into their existing zoning. And so I'm going to just stack my hands here for a minute. So apologies, I think with my hands. For conventional zoning, you can think about it as simply as like you're just slapping down a layer on your existing map in your community, right? So you spent the time, you carved up your community into different zoning districts based on the existing or planned uses within those districts. And you would just say, we're making this type of battery storage an allowable use in this district in that one, but not in these others, right? So you're just folding in energy storage into an existing or conventional zoning approach. Some alternates, overlay zoning is a concept by which you can slap, so remember we slapped that one conventional layer down on top of your map. You can add another one directly on top of it, which can cut across multiple districts as an overlay zone. And the idea there is that you can add different substantive requirements for development of a project or a certain technology within an overlay zone without having to go along with the existing zoning as you have it set up. Now, the reason you might be interested in doing that is that perhaps perhaps you've got energy infrastructure located in one half of, a industrial zone, but the other half of an industrial zone is further away from that electrical infrastructure, and it abuts, a residential zone or a hamlet zone, place where you've got like more dense commerce. You could consider an overlay zone so that you are implementing an approach that is, well considered with regard to proximity to the grid infrastructure, but trying to keep some distance from other, proximal land uses. Certainly an option. It's a bit more sophisticated and requires more upfront planning, but it's certainly a viable pathway. Finally, a floating zone. You keep those initial layers on the map, right? You've got your underlying land, and then you've got your zoning districts. A floating zone still would require you to establish relevant standards and requirements for a project, but instead of affixing the zone to your map as an overlay, it would be sort of a two-step process by which an application would trigger the creation of a floating zone. So if the board would decide to create the floating zone then gets added to the map, and then an applicant can submit an application for a project within that floating zone. So it adds a step. I would say certainly it depends on the interest and sophistication of the permitting board, which approach they want to take. Again, most people just use a conventional zoning approach as they would with other land uses, but there are certainly some options. Next slide, please. Perhaps the most important thing within the model law, which we'll talk about at the end in terms of our resources for local governments, the NYSERDA model law utilizes a two-tier approach by which systems that are above or below 600 kilowatt hours are required to meet different regulations and standards. I'm going to try and speed this up because I want to make sure we've got plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So 600 kilowatt hours is the threshold. Anything above that is going to be subject to a more rigorous permitting process. Anything below that will be subject to a simplified, streamlined process, still ensuring, pure enforcement with the fire code, right? So you still have that layer of protection, but creating a more streamlined process. Next slide, please. These are just some photo examples of what would be qualified as a tier 1 and tier 2 installation under the NYSERDA model law. So like residential through small commercial would be tier 1, and larger commercial through bulk projects would be tier 2 under the current NYSERDA model law. Next slide, please. Really just high level recommendations I would recommend people consider before we move on here. learn the fire code requirements. You don't have to know them by heart, but it's worth familiarizing yourself or making sure that your planning and code enforcement officials are familiarizing themselves with those requirements, because it can tell you a lot about the regulations that are already in effect in your community, again, without you having to do anything. It also helps you avoid duplication and conflict with the fire code when you're planning land use regulations. If you want to explore alternate structures and definitions, maybe you don't want a two-tier approach, you want 3 tiers, or for example, the model solar law that NYSERDA uses has 4 tiers based on different sizes of projects. If you want to consider an alternate approach, I would just implore you to base it on a well-considered and legitimate source. So the NYSERDA model law, that 600 kilowatt hour threshold, which my colleague Bill will talk about more at some point soon, that pulls directly from the fire code, right? So in the fire code, systems above 600 kilowatt hours are held to a much more robust series of requirements, including testing and site design and planning. Whereas systems under 600 kilowatt hours do not have to meet all of the same requirements. So that is where we pulled our delineating number from. If you want to consider alternate structures, we would just implore you to base it on something tangible and meaningful and not to just make up a number. Or if you want to talk to us about, what your sort of jumping off point might look like, we are happy to help. And again, Veronica will talk more about those resources available to local governments at the end of the presentation. And then finally, just consider the benefits, right? What systems are providing benefits on site versus remote versus larger grid benefits for your area or for the state of New York. Next slide. Next slide. We're going to just skip to the fire safety. I want to make sure that we get over there. Decommissioning, I'll just mention real quick. Decommissioning is a key question, right? We want to make sure that local governments are building decommissioning protections into their laws. That's all available in our guidebook in the model law. So with that in mind, Bill, I'm going to turn to you. I want to make sure we've got enough time for your section.
Thanks, Ian. And I will keep this pretty quick too, because we are coming up on time. As Ian said, we do want to have time for questions. Next slide, please, John. So as Ian said, my name is Bill Obercare. I'm a program manager on NYSERDA's Clean Energy Siting team. A lot of what I've been doing over the last couple of years is working with Governor Hochul's Interagency Fire Safety Working Group, which was convened after the 3 fires in the summer of 2023. You can see the agency participants there, and then in addition to the agency representation, we did include subject matter experts on energy storage fire safety to advise the working group at every step of the way, including folks who are sitting on the National Standards Committee, so the NFPA 855 Committee, the International Fire Code Committee. We had access to those folks through the working group for their expert guidance through all of the activities that the working group took, which you can see there on the right. Next slide, please. And I think what probably got the most press and is most relevant to this conversation is in 2024, the Fire Safety Working Group published fire code recommendations for the New York State Fire Code. They were adopted in July of 2025. They went into effect on December 31st, 2025. So all of the fire code recommendations that you see on the screen here have been implemented into the code that is in effect right now in all of New York State, with the exception of New York City. So instead of going through these, I would point folks, and Veronica, I think we'll do this again later, to the Fire Safety Working Group website, where you can see a report outlining the logic behind all of these. And importantly, these aren't kind of things that were made up because they would be nice. These recommendations were very much done in concert with a review of existing national standards and codes. So in that report document, you will see the code references from where these ideas come from and the codes that they've already been implemented in. I think there are only a handful of them that are completely new, just some common sense things like, have video surveillance. That was not a code requirement. And in the wake of those fires, we saw how useful the video surveillance was, both in incident response and incident investigation. So we decided, it's not cost prohibitive to make that a requirement. Let's just do it. There's a few other key ones that I'll pick up later in the presentation, but for now, can we go to the next slide, please? So one of the key issues identified by the working group is that when we have project applications for energy storage systems. They are tremendously complex. There's a cross-section of electrical engineering, chemical engineering, mechanical engineering, fire protection engineering, and this technology kind of sits at the nexus point of all of those very complicated disciplines. So in New York State, we have about 1,000 authorities having jurisdiction. And we realized, kind of the error in our ways of expecting 1,000 different communities at different level of resources available to them to have folks who are sophisticated enough to really be able to evaluate these projects and their designs for safety. So what NYSERDA did was send out a competitive solicitation and hired 3 firms, Camelot Energy Group, DNV, ESRG, they're listed on the slide, to work with NYSERDA's incentive programs to do that peer review at the state level. So what they're doing is an expert review of the project designs for code compliance with the fire code, with the National Electric Code, and other applicable codes and standards. Important to notice that this is very intentionally a redundancy to home rule authority. So this isn't NYSERDA coming in and saying we're the permitting authority now and our peer reviewers are going to sign off on it. That's not the case. We still preserve local home rule authority. The authority having jurisdiction is the legal permitting authority for these projects. This process, the peer review process through NYSERDA's incentive program, is a redundancy. So it's just we are also checking on behalf of the state, on behalf of the incentive programs, to make sure that we have good, safe designs that are reaching code officials at the local level for review and approval. So that's what this is about. We saw the need through the work of the working group to have a little bit of extra technical support in evaluating project designs. So that's what we have here. And this is something that New York City has been doing since 2018. And you'll see a lot of this new code that New York just adopted comes from things that the city had already implemented, New York City. Next slide, please. This is a process map for the peer review. The target audience here is more industry. So when an applicant applies to the NYSERDA incentive program, this is what they can expect to see. It is also useful to understand from the AHJ side to give you folks an idea of what's going on with NYSERDA before folks are getting their project designs to you all for review and evaluation. The high level of this is the process on the NYSERDA end is expected to take between 45 and 60 business days. And that depends on mostly on document turnarounds. So this is an iterative process. There will be back and forth between the expert peer reviewers and the project applicants. Things in the designs will need to be changed, will need to be tweaked. So that's why we have, a range of time of 45 business days to 60 business days, just depending on how smoothly things go. Next slide, please. I want to get into some of the national standards for energy storage systems, and I think these are the 2 most important from the product, meaning the equipment point of view. And New York's code, as well as the national standards, NFPA 855, the International Fire Code, all incorporate these standards by reference. So the New York code requires both a UL 9540 equipment listing and UL 9540A test data. I'm going to quickly, as I can, go through the difference between those 2 things. UL 9540 is an equipment listing. That's a stamp. That's an approval. It's a yes or no. It's binary. What UL is saying by issuing the UL 9540 equipment listing is that all of the components of the system work safely in harmony together. That this unit, as a unit, has been tested with all of those components in place, and there is no additional or unnecessary hazard caused by this equipment being used in conjunction with the rest of the system. So again, that's binary. You either have the UL equipment listing or you don't. There is no in between. The UL 9540A test is not binary. It is a test method. The test is not a pass-fail test. The UL 9540A test involves initiating thermal runaway in the system and then recording how that system behaves once thermal runaway has been induced. So this is basically a hazard mitigation measure. in order to know how we need to site these projects and what sort of separation distances we need, we're going to set it, we're going to induce thermal runaway. We're going to create the situation that we're most worried about and see what it does, and then base our decisions off of that lab data instead of making, even educated guesses about what the case should be. So the 9548 data is basically the results of how the system performed when thermal runaway was induced. And those results can produce very valuable information about siting decisions like size and separation distances, distances to lot lines, distances to other equipment. So this is the 9540A test method is a packet of data that needs to be interpreted, versus the equipment listing is a pass-fail. Do you have the equipment listing or not? And I think that's probably the key difference. Next slide, please. One of the things that gets thrown around quite a bit, and the reason for the existence of this slide, is that energy storage systems are a brand new technology and the regulations haven't caught up to the industry. All of these standards that you see on this slide are applicable to energy storage systems, and they're all national standards. This is before New York even gets involved. This is the work that's getting done at the national level. So you can see that we have the UL standards. It's not just 9540 and 9540A. We also have some other ones that are subsidiary to 9540 and an inverter listing through UL. So that's the fire safety industry certifying equipment, essentially underwriting it. Then we move on to the International Fire Code, which is the ICC, or International Code Committee's template document, modeled code document. This is the basis of the New York State Fire Code. So the International Fire Code, again, incorporates those UL standards, and it also draws from NFPA 855, which you'll see in the laundry list of NFPA standards below. NFPA 855 is really the parent standard, the grandparent standard for the installation of energy storage systems in the US. That is the most sophisticated from which the others tend to draw. For folks who don't know or may not know, NFPA stands for National Fire Protection Association. So this is the dominant entity in fire protection in the United States. And you see there, this is not an exhaustive list, but all of those NFPA standards listed all apply to energy storage systems individually, above and beyond the NFPA 855 standard, which governs the overall installation of the system. So you can see that there's quite a robust framework of code standards and regulations that apply to this technology before we even get to New York. And next slide, please. So then we drill down to the New York context, which is where we as a state incorporate these national codes and standards. And I'll do a little history lesson of this in case folks don't know. But in May 2020, the 2020 Uniform Code goes into effect. And this is based on the draft 2021 NFPA 855, or 2020 NFPA 855. So you can see that there's a direct relation. If you had those two standards side by side, you would notice more similarities than differences between the language within them. So those were really the first, in 2020, the first lithium ion specific regulations for New York outside of New York City. And in the years between, what we call a code cycle in the code world, the Fire Safety Working Group did its work on the code recommendations, made those recommendations to the New York Code Council, which is responsible for creating and adopting the Uniform Code, which is state law and applies universally with the exception of New York City, without the need for local adoption, as Ian said earlier in the presentation. So the July 2025 code is what we have in effect right now. That went into effect on December 31st of last year. And this is where we see New York, again, incorporating all of those national standards, all of the best practices at the national level. But because of the work of the Fire Safety Working Group and our subject matter experts that we had on hand, we start to see New York exceed those national standards. So right now, if you took the section 1207 of the 2025 Fire Code of New York State, which is the section on energy storage system, as Ian said before, I would recommend anyone who is interested to read that section. You don't have to read 1,000 pages of fire code. It's about 15 pages. It would take you an hour to read to understand it. I would strongly recommend that everyone do it. It's right there in section 1207, all in one place. But if you took our section 1207 right now of the New York State Fire Code and put that side by side with the 2023 NFPA 855, you would start to see that New York is exceeding those national standards. And we are, to my knowledge, the first state to do that, beyond New York City doing that. And the national standards making bodies have actually started to look at what New York has done and incorporate that into their standards. So we're kind of creating this feedback loop of influencing each other in ways to make these systems as safe as humanly possible without over-regulating to the point where we destroy the industry. That is the needle that needs to be thread with this type of regulation, and that is, what folks are aiming to do here. Next slide, please. So I just want to wrap up before passing off to my colleague Veronica with a few key takeaways. When you saw that slide up toward the top of all of the fire code recommendations, these are the ones that I just want to highlight. One, peer reviews. So that independent design review used to be optional. It used to be that the code official had the authority to require that. Now the code is saying that is required for all projects over 600 kilowatt hours. So we're moving that discretionary element and just making it mandatory across the board. Another gap that was identified by the Fire Safety Working Group was the lack of a requirement for emergency response plans. So now that is a hard code requirement. And in addition to the emergency response plan that must target first responders, if folks are familiar with the industry, we often think of emergency action plans or emergency response plans as targeting facilities personnel. That's not what we're doing here. They're specifically targeted toward first responders responding to an incident at that site. In addition to creating that plan, industry must offer annual training to local fire service. So they're going to be responsible for taking the local first responders through the emergency response plan, going through the O&M log, and doing a site familiarization tour to make sure that the folks who are on staff at the local fire department this year are trained in how to deal with the worst case scenario of this piece of development. And then finally, there is a requirement for hazard support personnel provided by industry. This is actually pretty standard when you look at uses of hazardous materials in the fire service. So this requires the industry, the project developer, to contract with folks who must arrive on scene within 4 hours in the event of an incident. They're there for two reasons. One is to kind of quarterback the strategy of the emergency response, and then two is to take on fire watch so that we don't have our local first responders standing and babysitting glowing embers of an energy storage system while there is a reignition risk. We're handing that off to industry so that they're the ones monitoring for reignition, and they can alert local emergency response teams instead of the local emergency response team having to stand by the entire time. And that is our section on fire safety. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Veronica to walk folks through how to find some more information on everything that we've talked about so far today on NYSERDA's website.
Thanks, Bill. Hello, everybody. My name is Weronika Ciechowska-Polanco. I'm a project manager on Clean Energy Siting team. And I just have 2 slides for you. So we're at the very end. I just want to share with you some resources that we have. Next slide, please. So if you so NYSERDA's website has a lot of information. Sometimes it could be a little bit tricky to find it. But if you need more support, you can simply Google NYSERDA Clean Energy Siting Team, and you will find a lot of resources that are just for you. And our team is there to help local governments like you. We have a battery energy storage guidebook that has a lot of information regarding local law, draft permit. Also, we provide hands-on education, and we provide training, one-on-one or group training. We have a lot of pre-recorded trainings. Actually, one of the from last year pertains to fire safety, and takes a deep dive into a fire safety. Deploying safe lithium-ion energy storage in your community. So strongly recommending this one. And we also have regional clean energy advisors that can help the different AHJs with one-on-one or group training as well. We can go to the next slide. And also, you'll be able to find, like I mentioned, fire safety working group resources. There's a separate website that has a lot of documents that you can download and use it. There's a data collection press release pertaining to the 2023 incidents, if you're interested in that. The code recommendations that were implemented this year, there are explained in depth why and why they were implemented. And also there are additional resources like lithium-ion battery awareness course or battery fire service response guide. So all of these resources are available. And you can also email us at cleanenergyhelp@nyserda.ny.gov. Next slide.
Thanks, Veronica.
You're welcome.
And thanks to Bill and Abby and Seth and others, everyone who's helping on the webinar today and also behind the scenes. Would like to encourage folks to ask some questions. Going to do our best to address many of those that have come in throughout the course of the webinar today. I just want to name quickly, we spend a lot of time on our team talking to communities and local government stakeholders about these questions. You don't always have access to folks who are involved in running the procurement. So if you've got questions particularly related to the bulk storage procurement process or anything, feel free to throw those in the Q&A feature now. I'll at least start with, I know, one question that came up with regard to that. There was a question about the relationship between the bulk procurement and local planning board approval. And so I just want to quickly address that. The question had to do with if a project is coming to a municipal board having submitted an application, what can we assume about their relationship to a NYSERDA award? Do they have an award? The short answer is no. Not necessarily, right? So NYSERDA contract awards and those competitive procurements are fully separate processes from land use approvals and planning decisions, right? So an application that you may receive may be a project that is awarded by NYSERDA, maybe a project that was not awarded, maybe a project that wishes to enter a future competitive procurement but hasn't yet. Those are fully separate decisions. NYSERDA is not a permitting authority, fully separate. So Abby, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that.
Yeah, one thing I would add is that it was a requirement for our first RFP that any participant had to notify the local AHJ that they were planning to participate in our RFP. So if you somewhat recently heard from proposers, that means that they submitted an application and that they do not have, like, they don't necessarily have an ISC awards yet. We are still evaluating those. And just because they submitted an application and notified you all does not mean that they are guaranteed an award. And it also doesn't necessarily mean that they, even if they get an award, that they will be built. That's where you all come back into the process and they go through any of those processes that you all run. So an ISC award is not able to guarantee that the project will operate if they aren't paid until they do.
And it's also, thank you, Abby. It's also worth reiterating. Selection for an award under a procurement like this one does not mean that the money awarded is available to that developer up front, right? These are projects that are compensating these projects based on the electricity that they store and then provide back to the grid, right? It's sort of a fee for service almost type of incentive payment, right? It's based on the actual work that these facilities are doing for the grid. And therefore, receipt of a contract does not mean that ratepayer dollars are flowing to a project that has not yet been built, is not yet operating. That is not how these incentive programs work. So yeah, thank you for the question. If there are other questions, again, regarding the bulk storage procurement, while you have the team here, please do feel free to throw them in the chat. In the meantime, we'll talk about some of the other questions that came in. There's a question about identifying the peer review firms that NYSERDA works with as part of its peer review process. And I want to just, it was answered in the Q&A feature, but want to just reiterate it here. So Bill mentioned 3 firms that were competitively selected to provide peer review services for projects participating in a NYSERDA program, right? So if a project wants to receive a NYSERDA award, it has to do a supplemental peer review of its application. This is a separate peer review process from that which is required under the fire code. So think about that as a peer review for the NYSERDA program. There's also a peer review for local permitting decisions administered by the municipality. The 3 firms that are in the slides that you'll see are not the only firms that might be selected to provide peer review services. So it's really important that applicants and permitting authorities are working together to identify good service providers, engineering firms, fire protection engineering firms that can provide those services. Just want to make it clear that the 3 firms that were competitively selected by NYSERDA are not the only 3 that are able to provide that service for projects in the market. We'll keep us going. There was a question about building in New York City and why that's different than building elsewhere in the state for bulk storage. And I would say that distinction is not a bulk storage specific thing whatsoever. So New York City is authorized under state law to administer its own fire code. So the uniform code that is applicable everywhere else in New York does not govern fire code and does not govern development and installations for anything in the city of New York. I don't know the exact history because I was not alive when that state law authorized the New York City to have its own code. But I would imagine it's because New York City development there and building there looks very different than it does elsewhere in the state of New York. They've got a very robust series of agencies that are responsible for overseeing permitting. Some may argue that it's too robust, but that depends on who you are and what you're trying to do in New York City. But the point being that they've got a very robust permitting environment pursuant to their own code that is fully distinct from the state code. And as Bill mentioned, with regard to energy storage, particularly, New York City's code has been more advanced and best in class, even outpacing that of the state. So some of the work that went into updating the state code was borrowing from the code that Bill and others had helped get into place within New York City prior. Let's see, we'll keep us moving. There was a couple of questions, and I should note that if it wasn't made clear earlier, and I apologize, that we're not able to discuss any project-specific information that may be associated with a project pending having submitted an application for an award in this procurement. And so any of our questions and answers will be very project agnostic. With that in mind, couple of questions that came through asking about siting considerations, right? So proximity to other land uses or sensitive areas or other factors within a community. These projects are subject to local permitting, right? Which means local law will dictate where a permit is issued for a standalone battery project within a community. And so, there's 2 sort of questions to ask, right? There's the question of like, why would a project be proposed in a certain area? And then there's the question of how is the community planning to regulate projects within a certain area? The first question is very simple to answer. I mentioned earlier that the primary consideration is grid infrastructure, right? So projects are most likely to be proposed in places where you've got you're as close to high voltage grid infrastructure, whether that's a substation or a transmission line, you're as close to that as possible, and you've got land available to do it, right? From there, a developer might look at zoning or might look at proximal land uses, but really the first thing they're looking for is, does this make sense for the grid that we are looking to plug into? They also don't get to make that decision in the vacuum. I mentioned earlier that utilities and the NYSO are responsible for administering an interconnection process. These are not decisions that are made like that. For these bulk projects, they require a multi-year long interconnection process that costs the developers thousands and thousands of dollars to ensure that the electric grid can function well with these new projects that are proposing. That goes into informing why a particular site might be selected or proposed by a developer. You then have the question of actual approval, right? That's where the local government comes in. The local government, as the permitting authority, is responsible for identifying within a zoning law where they think that these projects should be an allowable use and any regulations and standards to which they want to hold a project that's being proposed in their community. So that's how and where a project might be proposed. That's how and where it's regulated. NYSERDA as a funding agency has nothing to do with discretionary land use decisions being made by a local government, other than that we want to help where we can, right? So our siting team, we don't have relationships with projects. We're not the ones that are involved in award decisions. Our bread and butter is working with communities and local governments to help them adopt well-considered regulations to help get ahead of applications coming to their community. And so if and where your community finds herself interested in those services, Veronica outlined some of the resources we have available, and we'd be more than happy to assist. We'll quickly pause. Are there any of my colleagues that want to add anything with regard to the siting related questions that came into the chat? I want to give Bill, Hannah, Veronica, if there's anything you guys would like to add, welcome you to do so now. Okay, hearing none, I'll keep going and I will go back and look through the questions that have come in. There's a question about, in practice, NYSERDA receiving index storage credit payments from energy storage developers based on trends in the strike price. Abby, we'll let you answer beyond just saying that this is the first one. So if you want to go ahead and speak to that.
Yeah, so this is our first index storage credit, so we credit solicitation. So we don't have any actual data from projects yet. There are no projects that are receiving index storage credits at this point, but the index storage credit RFP was modeled after some of the other programs we have here at NYSERDA for renewable energy certificates and similar for offshore wind renewable energy certificates. And so in other NYSERDA programs, we have seen it where we index the strike price that there are payments made back to the state. So that certainly does happen. And I'll also add that we do have a process for weeding out the projects that are not cost competitive. So before we receive bids, we go through this benchmark ISC price setting process, where we essentially set a price that we are no longer willing to pay for projects after, or that we will not even consider paying for projects after. And so if we get bids in that exceeds that benchmark ISC cost, then we throw them out, we don't evaluate them. And then we have separate processes that we go through to really kind of parse out all the projects that are below that benchmark cost to make sure that they are cost competitive, and we do a lot of our own internal modeling on how that impacts average residential bills. Like we'll actually see how many cents it would add to an average residential customer on their bill if we award this award group versus this award group. And so those are the types of things that we do when we're looking at ISC prices ahead of time. And yes, TBD on actual ISC data, but based on experience from other programs, we do receive payments back from developers.
Awesome. Thanks, Abby. We're going to take just two real quick. I know we're shedding some participants, which means we must be at time. I think we've almost done a good job of staying right on time. So if you'll allow me to just go maybe a minute or two over. Real quick, questions that are somewhat related with regard to enforcement of the fire code upfront, but also ongoing. We'll start with the upfront question. If and where, what is a planning board that is reviewing an application, what do they need to ensure that a project is in compliance with the code? A couple of things here. First, we'll say that the planning board is not typically or not always the body that is actually evaluating code compliance, right? That is your building and your code enforcement people. Not to say that the planning board doesn't have a role in that or that they won't work in conjunction with them, but the key thing I want to name here is that don't be on an island, right? If you're a planning board and you have code enforcement staff or you have a building staff in your municipality, make sure that they are familiarizing themselves with the requirements for this technology should you have an application. Code enforcement official trainings we have offered all the way back to 2019. So even if you're just hearing about this for the first time now, some of your communities, some of your fellow municipalities are not, right? We've been doing trainings for code enforcement officials for 6 years plus. To teach them where and what to look for in the fire code when reviewing an application. We are updating those training resources to be evergreen with the new version of the fire code. So we will, certainly make people aware once those are published this year, and please keep an eye out for that. But yeah, the short answer there is don't do it on your own on an island. Other things I will say, the peer review requirement in the fire code ensures that the municipality and the permitting authority is not alone in reviewing applications for compliance with the code, right? So leverage the requirement that is in there for third-party peer review. It used to be that it was optional, that the local government had the option to require a peer review. It is no longer optional, it is required, which means you, by default, no matter what, you have a third-party independent body that is capable of reviewing applications for, code compliance, and for, safe system design. Those are services that are furnished by the developer at their cost. So it also will not be impacting the municipality in terms of paying for that third-party review. That's the sort of upfront in reviewing an application code question, right? There's also the question of how do you ensure compliance with the code down the line, right? There's a question of what happens if the operator or the owner of a system is not keeping up with annual fire department training requirements? That is a code compliance issue, right? It is hardwired into the code that on an annual basis, they need to offer annual site visits and reviews of the emergency response plans, training for first responders. If they're not in compliance with the code, it's the same as any municipal, enforcement requirement for a lack of code compliance, right? Citations, fines, penalizing an owner or an asset, an operator within your community. You, a local AHJ, is responsible for ensuring that. So, suspending operating permits, enforcing fines against an applicant or a project operator, things like that. It's no different than any other type of, code enforcement issue. And that's why it's in the code. We want to make it a requirement. Where it's not happening, those asset owners or applicants deserve to be penalized and held to account for not complying with the code. There were a couple of other questions we weren't able to get to. I apologize, but we tried to answer the ones that are most relevant for everybody here. I want to thank you guys for your engagement and for asking some great questions. The recording of this webinar and the accompanying slides will be posted on NYSERDA's website, which is again nyserda.ny.gov/ISC-RFP, the Index Storage Credit Request for Proposal. We will also send a link to all of this material to all of the folks who attended. So again, thank you very much for your time on this beautiful Wednesday. Hope everyone has a good rest of your day. And please reach out if you've got any questions or ways that we can support your community moving forward. And John, thank you for running a smooth webinar. Appreciate you.